Welcome to the discussion of the circulatory system in you, which here we'll see that is going to be consisting of blood cells and other components that will transport materials throughout your entire body to all of your trillions of cells. So why do we have such a complex circulatory system? Well, this is due to the fact that our cells internally are trapped on the inside away from the external environment. So here we have a circulatory system that is relatively complex, that is referred to as a closed system, which means that it is contained inside of blood vessels that are going to be receiving the blood from the heart. This will then interconnect with all of the individual cells of the body so that they can exchange those materials with the external environment. So when we start to see that the blood is consisting of different cell types, there are three major general types of blood cells. There are erythrocytes, which are referred to as red blood cells, and these are the cells that contain the hemoglobin, and hemoglobin has the ability to pick up oxygen and eventually exchange that with the tissues of the body. The other component here would be the white blood cells, and there are different types of white blood cells, but in a general sense they assist in the immune response to help to destroy pathogens, which are these disease-causing organisms such as bacteria and viruses. So the white blood cells, or the leukocytes, assist in the immune defense response. And then the other and last component are the cellular portions known as platelets, which are more described as cellular fragments, which these are just small fragments of cell-like structures, which are also referred to as thrombocytes, which assist in the clotting factors that are going to prevent the blood from being released through the body if the blood and circulatory systems are damaged. And the remainder of the blood that is not cellular, not red blood cells, not white blood cells, or the platelets, is referred to as the plasma. And the plasma is where the dissolved materials are going to be transported through the body, such as nutrients, mainly in the form of glucose, but other amino acids. And then here we'll also see that hormones can be transported through, which are interconnected with the endocrine system, as well as the exchanges of gases, which of course are going to bring in the oxygen and release the carbon dioxide, which is found connected to the respiratory system. So the blood itself is interconnected through all parts of the body to exchange these materials with the individual cells. So when we see our circulatory system, it can be subdivided into three major regions. One would be the pulmonary circulation, which is going to exchange the blood supply with that of the lung and respiratory areas to exchange gases picking up oxygen and releasing carbon dioxide to the outside environment. But then there is also a coronary circulation that, even though the blood has it flowing through the heart, the individual cardiac cells require exchanges of gases, and so you'll see that there are blood vessels, arteries, and veins that surround the heart and give the blood supply through to the heart, which is the coronary circulation. And then if it's not pulmonary circulation to the lungs or coronary circulation to the heart, all other circulation throughout the entire body is referred to as the systemic circulation, which goes to your head, your arms, your internal organs, and all of your extremities. Now, what carries the blood through all of those circuits are blood vessels, and there are three major types of blood vessels. There are arteries that carry the blood away from the heart, there are veins that carry the blood back to the heart, and then there are the capillaries, which are very, very small, that we'll see help in exchanging gases and materials with the individual cells. With these three different types of generalized blood vessels, we'll see that arteries are going to have characteristics that help them withstand the pressure of the heartbeat because they are carrying the blood away from the heart and are under higher pressure. But as the blood goes away through these arteries, they eventually reach small, very, very small diameter blood vessels known as the capillaries, which by being small increase surface area for exchange efficiency. But then as the exchange occurs in the capillaries, it starts its way back to the heart through veins here, which as we see have less muscular tissue because they are under less pressure and are bringing the blood back to the heart. Now, one thing about arteries is that they can only carry blood away from the heart, but they do have this very thick layer of smooth muscle tissue that will be able to contract and relax to allow the blood flow through. And because it is under higher pressure, this is going to help withstand that pressure as it is going to be released away from the heart. One thing about arteries, though, is that arteries can carry both oxygenated and deoxygenated blood, as we would see with the pulmonary artery going away from the heart to the lungs would not have oxygen-rich blood at that point, and so would be deoxygenated. But then when it exchanges in the lungs, it would come back to the heart through pulmonary veins, which would then be carrying the oxygen-rich blood. So as we see here with veins, as they are bringing the blood back to the heart, they are having a thinner layer of the smooth muscle tissue because they don't have to withstand this great pressure as it comes away from the heart as arteries do. But, as it was mentioned previously, veins only carry it in the direction, because systemic veins would be carrying oxygen-poor blood back to the heart, whereas pulmonary veins would be carrying that oxygen-rich blood back to the heart. Another identifying feature that is different between arteries and veins is that because of the low pressure, blood needs some assistance to get back into the heart through these veins, and so veins have backflow valves that are going to prevent the backflow of blood going against the direction. So by these valves here, they will close off when the heart relaxes so that the blood doesn't swash around in the cardiovascular system. Now here we see a picture of my legs, which I'm not really a shorts guy, but veins do break down. And as we see here with varicose veins, these backflow valves sometimes are becoming too elastic and they do not prevent all of the backflow of blood, and they actually start to pool the blood here, causing the irregular appearance to the venous system. Now, as mentioned, capillaries are found to exchange the material between the arteries carrying the blood away towards the tissues, and then the veins carrying the blood back to the heart. And as we subdivide these into smaller and smaller areas, these capillaries increase the surface area for exchange of gases and other materials to the tissues. There are also different types of arteries and veins. If we look here at this large artery, arteries subdivide into smaller blood vessels, which are still arteries, but are referred to as arterioles. So the arteries carry the blood to the arterioles, which then are getting into smaller areas, increasing the surface area once again, before they reach the capillary beds, where here we see exchanges of gas taking place. But then on the way back, there are also smaller areas of veins known as venules that then transport that blood back, going to the vein and then ultimately back to the heart. Now, once we look at the heart is the major beating organ that pushes the blood through the cardiovascular system. Here, these are stimulated by different nodes. Here, the beginning one, the sinoatrial node, that sends electrical impulses through and then eventually reaches the atrioventricular node that then will distribute the electrical impulse going through the heart down to where all chambers will be contracted and push the blood in the correct direction. When we take a look at the mammalian heart, we're going to notice that there are 4 chambers, 2 here that we see to the right, and then 2 here that we see to the left. Now note that when you're viewing the heart, you would be viewing it as if it were in a patient. So this portion, even though it appears to be on the left, if you were viewing it from an individual, would be their right side, and then the same applies to the left portion here, which, as we see it on our right, would be found positioned on the left side of the organism. And then there's also the 2 upper chambers here that we refer to as the atria, and 2 lower chambers here that we refer to as ventricles. And when the heart contracts, we're going to see that there is increased pressure that we would be referring to this as the systolic portion of the contraction. And then there's also the relaxation portion, which is the diastolic. And this electrical impulse can be seen in electrocardiograms, where here there is a P wave. A P wave is where the atria contract initially, which is a smaller type of contraction because the atria always carry the blood only to the ventricles, which does not require a massive amount of work. But then when the ventricles below contract, you have this huge QRS spike in the amount of electricity going through, which is then going to pump the blood, which through the ventricles is much more muscularized, to larger and farther regions away, namely the systemic system and then also the pulmonary system. And then as we see here, there is a T wave, which is where the ventricles are recovering and repolarizing themselves, getting ready for another contraction. Now the heart also has two sets of valves. There are a set of valves in between the atria and the ventricle, which are referred to as the right atrioventricular valve or the tricuspid valve, and then that to the left, which could be described as the left atrioventricular valve or the bicuspid valve. Then, when these are closed, it will prevent the backflow of blood, similar to how the valves did that in the veins of the circulatory system. And then we also see here the other set of valves, which these are semilunar valves. Here we see the semilunar valve leading out to the aorta, hence named the aortic semilunar valve, and then this one here leading out into the pulmonary system, which is the pulmonary semilunar valve, as one would guess. So putting all of this together of how the heart contracts to force the blood into the correct directions, we see that there's also a different coloration here to the blood vessels. As noted earlier with some of the other diagrams, if it is represented in blue, blue represents oxygen-poor blood, and then if we see here in red, that refers to oxygen-rich blood. So blood coming in to the right side of the heart is oxygen poor, and so it comes in through these two structures here. One, the superior vena cava, because as superior suggests, it is above, and then the one here, the inferior vena cava, coming from below. But all of this oxygen poor blood reaches the right atrium through the vena cavas, and then when the atria contract, it opens up this tricuspid valve and it forces the blood into the right ventricle. But because it is oxygen poor, it needs to go to the pulmonary system. So when the ventricles contract here, it's going to close off the tricuspid valve as it increases the pressure that eventually builds and forces the blood to go in this one direction past the pulmonary semilunar valve, then goes to the pulmonary trunk, and then as we are going away from the heart, goes through these pulmonary arteries to eventually pulmonary arterioles, reaching the lungs and what we will describe as the alveoli, exchanges the blood with the capillaries and the alveoli, and then picks up the oxygen, which then makes its way back to the heart through pulmonary venules, and as it gets into larger blood vessels, these pulmonary veins carrying it back to the heart, now as we can see oxygen-rich, comes into the left side of the heart through into the left atrium. So when the left atrium contracts, it then passes by the bicuspid valve into the left ventricle, which then, when this contracts, closes off the bicuspid valve, and then it opens up as the pressure builds this valve, which is the aortic semilunar valve, and then forces this oxygen-rich blood through the aorta to all the different areas of the systemic circulation. So there are also supporting organs to the cardiovascular system. One, of course, the nervous system, which helps to maintain the balance found as components into the blood, and will exchange messages so that we could increase circulatory rates, decrease circulatory rates, or all other components in the blood to maintain homeostasis. Now, red blood cells, we will see, do not have a nucleus, and because of this, are going to be only having a lifespan of about up to 3 months. So we need to continuously make more red blood cells, which is performed by the accompanying red bone marrow that's found in our skeletal system. Now, another thing that we see here is that the spleen is of great consequence to our circulatory system as it breaks down old red blood cells and eventually stores iron and recycles that for components in the blood. And then there are also the kidneys that we will see here later on that are going to assist in filtering the blood that eventually remove metabolic waste, but also help to regulate the blood pressure and also the solute concentration, and can even assist in maintaining the pH balance. Now let's tie together our respiratory system that we see interconnected with this cardiovascular system to exchange gases with the blood. Now, first off, looking at the mammalian way in which air is brought into the lungs to fill up, this is performed by our diaphragm, so that when the diaphragm contracts downward, it's going to increase this volume of the thoracic cavity, which then is going to produce an inspiration where it makes a negative pressure and we suck the air in, very similar to a vacuum cleaner. But then when that air has been brought into the lungs as the diaphragm contracted downward, the diaphragm also then has the ability to relax where it is pulled upward, and when that goes upward, it puts a positive pressure on that thoracic cavity, and then we force the air out during the expiration. So when we see the diaphragm contracting downward, we will see that the air comes in through these external nares, or what's known as the nasal opening. And so then past this nostril, it goes into the nasal cavity where air starts to be filtered and also cleansed and warmed up as it begins to also be moisturized on its way down, eventually into reaching the lung area. So as this then is occurring throughout the respiratory system, it passes through the pharynx, which is a region where both the food and the air mix. Now, when we start looking at our digestive and respiratory systems, we'll note that the digestive system is found to the back, where the esophagus will take the food down to the stomach, but our respiratory system here lies in front. So when this pharynx area has the food coming in, it has to slide past this opening to the larynx, which is going to be assisted by this small structure here, which isn't labeled, but it is our epiglottis. So this epiglottis closes down, allowing the food to go back into the digestive system and reach the esophagus, but then when we are breathing, this epiglottis must be open for the air to then continue down to the larynx. Now, in the larynx, this is where we house our vocal cords, and these vocal cords can be manipulated and put pressure upon to eventually produce different tonations of voice. So then as we continue through reaching the lungs, it's going to pass from the larynx into the trachea, which is cartilaginous C-rings, which helps to keep the structure and support of the trachea open, but also provides some flexibility so that we can manipulate that as the air is going through. But then we see here eventually branches at the bronchus, and so we're going to see that there is a right bronchus and a left bronchus, where we then continue subdividing into the secondary bronchi, and then even farther subdivisions, which are referred to as bronchioles. And these bronchioles eventually lead to these sac-like structures known as the alveolar sacs that then under investigation we'll see that are surrounded by the pulmonary capillary beds that are going to have that surface area to have the oxygen, which will then diffuse into the capillaries from the alveoli, which at the same time the CO2 will diffuse out back into the alveoli as the exchange takes place. Here we see that exchange in greater detail, where the pulmonary arterioles carrying that oxygen-poor blood, represented in blue, comes in, surrounds the alveoli, where here the capillaries are exchanging, and we see that the color changes, picking up the oxygen content, making it bright red, and then as it comes back through pulmonary venules, eventually through pulmonary veins, back to the heart, reaching the left atrium, and then continuing through the cardiac cycle.